Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Now, what can we learn about corporate cultures from religious cults? At first glance, they probably seem like completely different worlds. One involves strategy meetings, mission statements and quarterly targets. The other, manipulation, charismatic leadership and extreme behaviour. But perhaps they're not as different as we'd like to think. Both involve groups of people creating shared beliefs and norms. Both can generate strong feelings of identity and belonging. Both can gradually shape how people think and behave, often without them fully realising it. And of course, both can create lasting damage. As you'll have worked out, my guest, Tobias Sturesson, understands both. Tobias is a culture advisor and the author of You Can Culture, Transformative Leadership Habits for a Thriving Workplace, Positive Impact and Lasting Success. But his understanding of culture didn't come from business school or management theory. Tobias grew up in a religious community that gradually evolved into a cult. As he explains in our discussion, it began fairly innocently, and the community didn't begin with bad intentions, but over time, slowly norms shifted, difficult questions became harder to ask, and behaviours that once seemed unacceptable gradually became normal. He saw firsthand the damage that unhealthy cultures can create. Now, Tobias managed to escape, and you'll hear about that in the show. And since leaving that world, he's dedicated his career to understanding culture and helping organisations to build healthier ones. In our discussion, we explore a range of topics, including what corporate leaders can learn from cult dynamics, why speaking up can be difficult, the role humility plays in leadership, and why culture is shaped less by slogans on the wall and more by the everyday behaviours we choose to accept, or don't. I think you're going to find this fascinating, not just because Tobias has an amazing backstory, but also because he provides some really practical insights that I think can help manage many of the challenges that organisations face in the 21st century. So please enjoy, as I know you will, my discussion with Tobias Sturesson on shifting from cult to corporate culture. Tobias, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Hi, Christian. It's really a joy to be here. And I must say, I'm a fan. So this is very, very special to get to sit down with you like this.
I'm a fan of yours, which is why you are here. And this has been a long time coming, but I'm delighted we finally got you into the studio to have a conversation. I obviously know who you are, but some of my listeners might not have come across you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. So as you know, I'm very much focused on the topic of culture, cultural health, and I'll tell a little bit of the backstory to that. I often tell this to people because I think it connects with something that I think is deeply human. And I grew up in an Christian community, a Christian church that over time turned into a religious cult. And it didn't start off that way. I think that it really, really never does. But it happened step by step. You're excited about the vision. You're excited about the mission. You think that you're going to do great things in the world. Of course, I was a child at the time when we began, and my parents were very involved. And then over time, it became more the founder of this community became increasingly manipulative, became more and more us versus them, inside and outside. More and more people started to leave, and the rest of us who stayed became increasingly isolated, and yet thought that we were the ones who knew the answers, who had figured things out, and who are the ones who were really committed. And then the leader in this environment, he started to point out people, and it started with his former wife, and then he started pointing out other people who he saw as problematic and who were supposed to be ostracized, isolated, demonized. And one of them became my mother. My mother was one of the leaders in the environment, and for her, that led to it's difficult to understand from the outside. How do you're not forced to be there? How do you willingly get up in the morning and go to a place where you're going to suffer psychological abuse, and then yet come back day after day after day? And yet again, that's what happened. And of course, a lot of research on abuse will tell you why and how things work in these environments. But I became a part of that psychological abuse of my own mother. And for her, it ultimately led to her trying to commit suicide again and again and again, until she finally ended up in a psychiatric ward where she spent 2 years before she made the decision to leave. However, I still stayed, and so some time after that, there was this television program on Swedish television that told a story about what's been going on in this community, and my mother was one of the people interviewed, and you know, I still remember sitting there watching this, and then thinking, now it's all over, but at the same time having this rationalization machine inside that kept on rationalizing why things weren't as bad as they really were, and becoming a part of a cover-up, becoming a part of, I was at that time a part of the leadership, and going out with a press statement saying that in our desire to help people, some people were hurt, which didn't at all address what really happened. And then ultimately, I mean, I had this inner dissonance. I saw what had happened to my mother, saw what had happened to others. I started to get more and more of relationships on the outside, and when you start looking at things from the outside, you realize how unhealthy things are, and you start questioning more and more. And ultimately, I made the decision to leave, and I mean, since then, and that's really truly the driving force behind the work that I do, that really asking how an organization that to us, and of course to others hearing this, it just sounds like a crazy cult, but to us, that was something, that was a vision, that was a mission we believed in. We thought we were onto something. We thought we were going to do good in the world. How that could turn into something so toxic, and now how I could become complicit in psychological abuse. And that's, again, I mean, somebody could look at that and just say, I mean, he's just gullible and stupid. And that's probably partly true. But what I found since is that, yes, it doesn't necessarily go to those extremes, but we can see the same story happening again and again. And I've talked to so many researchers and whistleblowers and executives in organizations. And then, of course, most examples are not this extreme, but I've seen some of the extreme examples. I worked with organizations that have gone through scandals and crisis, but also in organizations facing much less nefarious things. We still, I think, struggle with this question of how do we end up, when we come together as a group, start to allowing certain behavior, and how certain behavior becomes the norm, and how that actually impacts how people who thought that they had a great moral compass suddenly start acting and getting off track. So those are topics that are near and dear to my heart.
Wow. Every time I hear you tell the story, my mind I've got more questions and more things. So I'm just going to ask you the one that sort of occurs to me now that I think is probably the most university relevant. Is we can easily sort of end up in things that morph and change over time. And we've all heard that apocryphal story about the frog in boiling water, which I hope isn't true as an experiment. But, you know, this idea that things can slowly, it's not there's a sudden thing, it slowly moves and we move along with it and norms get accepted. I'm fascinated by I can see how you get into it, but how do you get out? Because so you've talked about this realization. Is it a dawning realization over time? Are there sudden trigger points that are really significant? How does that process work?
Yeah.
Or how did it work for you, I guess?
Yeah. And I mean, for me, again, it was an inner dissonance. It was, you know, starting to question. There were certain things where I increasingly started to speak up about, and then getting more and more distance. So just I mean, there was a lot of activities going on in this community, and I increasingly became less and less involved, and connected with people who didn't judge me, but who just helped me see that, oh, maybe that sounds strange, or that's like, and you start seeing things from another perspective. And then another thing for me, I went through more of a personal crisis, which also is kind of those, we went through a divorce, which was also kind of that moment of waking up and asking myself, who am I? What am I part of? And then I ultimately chose to move my physical location further away from this community. And that was also something to just, helped create the distance. And so it was really a slow process.
Were you? I mean, it's a big retro. The shift getting out is a big thing. But at the time, what's the overwhelming feeling here? Is it this is going to be really hard, or does it just become more and more feeling like the right thing that you want to do?
No, it was still the feeling that this is going to be very hard. And I think, of course, what is a reality in a religious community is that there are certain elements of that have a spiritual, yeah, it is a spiritual element to it, and the idea of wanting to do God's will, and which becomes a bigger question than just kind of regular decisions. So of course that's something that adds a complex, or not complexity, but makes it more difficult in that sense. But I for sure, and when I moved away, for example, when I moved location, I mean, there was a lot of grappling with that. And I think one part of it as well is just, and I'm sure you're familiar with the with sunk cost fallacy, and I think that's really really true in unhealthy environments as well, because you've invested so much of your life into something, and if you realize that this is wrong, and not just that it wasn't all that it was made out to be, but also that it was unhealthy, toxic, and that you've actually been a part of abuse, psychological abuse. I mean, that's very difficult to navigate. And I think for most of us, we don't want to wrestle with those questions. So we choose to stay.
And you mentioned that you got help from people that didn't judge you. I'm fascinated by that, because I think one of the other things that's helpful to understand is if we ever come across people, this would apply, I guess, to abusive relationships, as you say, to cult situations, but there's loads of scenarios where people are sort of captured by something where they might need help. What was it about the people that were genuinely able to help you? Because I think we all have a desire, if we become aware that somebody's trapped in a situation, we want to do something. But the natural tendency is probably to sort of point out why it's a bad idea, to do logical responses to it. And actually, I think that point about not judging sounds really significant to me.
Yeah, it was significant. And I think that one part of it was that it was people that had that lived lives that I was inspired by. So that was one thing. And then the other thing is that they did not make me feel less because of my in that I still hadn't, I was not that involved at that moment, but I still hadn't left. And so they didn't make me feel like I was less or I was stupid or anything like that. But instead, I think it was that just curious conversations that was really, really helpful.
So you start to build a new life. At what point are you starting to sort of think about the dynamic? I mean, obviously, you as you're reflecting as you go, but you've made a change. At what point do you decide this is your career? I guess that looking into and understanding, working with these dynamics.
Yeah. So I mean, I was working in communications at the time, and working with what started with web and then strategic communications and so on, and working more and more with topics that really touched on culture, and where I saw, for example, working with governmental agencies that were going to, set a new vision, and I saw the challenges behind that, and how people's assumptions and beliefs could get, that it didn't matter what great visions they would put out on posters, but it was the assumptions and beliefs that people actually held on to that set the direction. And so that was part of it. Another part was then coming into an organization that I was invited into to help, that had gone through a crisis and a scandal. And where I got to be in a place where I could challenge them to actually deal with the past, where there was a lot of things. So again, they had been super successful in many ways, but the transition of leadership just there was a lot of things that came up connected with that, things that have happened in the past, toxic leadership, also things related to the leader that had left. And it became quite a big thing and in the news and so on. And working with them and seeing them actually having the courage to address what had been unhealthy in their culture, take ownership of it, and being willing then to start the process of transformation. And I work with them through that process. And it's one of the most powerful things I've seen, because I think most of the time leaders are not that willing to do that work. We just want to say, let's just move forward. But in their case, they had tried, but it didn't work. People had lost so much trust in the organization, in the leadership. But seeing that transformation, that I think for me was that spark. Just, yes, this is what I should, devote my professional life to, and whatever I can do to help ensure that we have less unhealthy cultures and less of irresponsible leadership. That's what I need to be doing.
How does it work in terms of, I guess you're getting business now, but also you sort of working with people early stage? One of the things that's fascinating, and I have a similar thing, is loads of people I could theoretically identify who I could help, but people have to want to be helped. And so there's an interesting thing about, I guess in your case, they're already going to have to start to be thinking about it. And so there's something that triggers them to get you. What are the points there? Is it a sort of realization that something does need to change, or is it that things have got so bad that they're looking for an alternative? What are the drivers there?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as you say, of course, there's a difference between the ones you think need help and the ones who are actually realizing that they need help. And I think that there often needs to be some form of pain. And that pain does not at all, I mean, in the case of our clients, that's not at all necessarily that they have a really toxic culture. And I also think it's very important to say that there are few organizations that are, just genuinely fundamentally toxic. In most cases, of course, health is on a scale. There are certain elements of the culture that are really helpful. There are other things that are holding the organization back and leading to unhelpful or problematic behavior and so on. So some form of pain. And that pain might be that we desperately need to change to deliver on our mission, on our goals, but there are certain things holding us back. We have history, for example, of regulatory problems because of unethical behavior. Like there might be many different things like that lead people then to seek the help, and whether they realize we can't really maybe either find out on a deeper level what the issue is, why we keep on seeing the same things happening again and again, or how to change things. And I think that's another thing as well, that so many organizations, they have run their culture change initiatives and they found that they don't give a lot of value. I mean, they don't lead to a lot of change. And I think actually many times it's like kind of think the picture, lighting a match in a dark room. When the match goes out, I mean, it feels even darker. And I think that's the reality in many organizations after a lot of these initiatives. So what do you then do to actually lead to real change? And I think a part of that as well is that for many people, culture is a topic that feels important and urgent, but that they don't really feel they understand or know what to do with. And I think that's also a reason to reach out for help, but some form of pain for sure.
And is it that people come to you with their analysis of the problem that's correct, or is it often that people come to you with a sort of, it's potentially that, because I've seen lots of scenarios where people describe what they think is wrong and you go in and go, that's not the problem at all. Yeah, that might just be a symptom, or that might not be the big issue you really need to worry about. Is there a lot of that, or are people generally good at sort of diagnosing what's there? Because I imagine, in the same way it was uncomfortable for you, is if I've got to the stage where I'm calling you in, I've kind of, to your point, there's some pain that's gone on. So I could see a world where you wouldn't necessarily want to face the full thing. You might want to point to something else, or you might not be capable of fully diagnosing it because you're in the middle of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for sure, one challenge is absolutely just facing it. that we don't really want to admit that things are like they are. I remember hearing an interview with I think it's now the former CEO of Lego, but when he came into the company, he said he needed people to understand how bad things were, which is very counterintuitive, especially to the American part of the organization. But they were really in a financial crisis, but people didn't know and they didn't understand. And so I think that's one thing, facing the reality and being willing to call that out. And when that happens, I think it can be incredibly powerful. But I think another thing as well is that often I find, and I'm interested in your experience there as well, like that people might see, don't know if it's symptoms, but like behaviors, behavioral patterns, cultural elements that are holding them back, but they don't really know the root causes behind them. And sometimes those root causes might actually show that the way we're trying to address the problem is part of the problem itself.
Right. Right. And that's sort of where I was going away, because I think all of these sorts of human topics, on the face of it, you kind of think, well, we're all human. We've all got experience. We should be able to sort this out ourselves. And the thing I think is interesting is that sometimes it takes deep expertise, right? I've seen these patterns before, you might not have done. But then sometimes it's also just a case of it's just being independent and being able to see the wood for the trees and that different perspective. So I agree. It's a field that I think self-diagnosis as to what's going on is problematic. One, because you may not want to go there. So even if you were very self-aware, you might not want to go there. But secondly, it's really hard to see. And I think thirdly, it's not like you can stop life and sort of go, let's just pause things while we think about what's going on, because it's just going on an ongoing basis. And so it's that classic thing about, there's some analogy about fixing the plane while it's flying. And I think that's one of the dynamics. So I could completely agree with you. And so I guess what you're bringing is credibility because you've been through this thing, independence, and then this degree of expertise. I would guess the three sorts of things, none of which is naturally available to people within organizations.
No, and I think one thing as well, and that is coming from a perspective that, so we talked before about that I met people who didn't judge me. And I think that's extremely important as well for me or for our team coming into an organization, that we don't come, on high horses. I was sitting recently with a leadership team where we needed to bring up real elephant on the table and some things that they had not talked about that were really, really difficult and really, really painful. And where I needed to, call people out or call them out to speak up and get real with each other. And, in that moment, I said to them, like, I'm not standing from above kind of pointing at you and saying, how could you do like that? Or how could you be like that? If anything, like I'm on my knees, like I don't have anything to come with in terms of saying how awesome I've been or because I've failed in so many ways. And I think that is also helpful to be able to say that and to come in with that level of respect. And then because that I think sometimes also just allows you to say things that are a lot harder to say otherwise.
I'm assuming as you do projects, I'd love to sort of hear what a typical one looks like. The sort of nature of the topic you're dealing with is this must be really hard work, right? Because you are dealing with the extremities of human emotion here, and you're having to think carefully about how you present things, how you present yourself. So I'm imagining it's quite an exhausting thing, very fulfilling, and I think brings an expertise that you clearly have, but must be quite exhausting for you, I imagine.
Yeah, and I think, and what I try to remind myself of is, and remind our team of, is that we're not here to impress anyone. And I think whenever I try, which I'm tempted to do, try to sound smart or to be whatever and impress someone, I'm not very useful. But when I come with a heart of being helpful, then I think, yeah, but I can be helpful. And I think that's, I think that's really important. I think I don't know how you find that as well when it comes to, just the whole world of LinkedIn and all of that. I get very exhausted when I think generally about my platform or whatever I'm trying to build. But when I just focus on how can I be helpful, I think that, that connects it back to the why, and that also gives the energy to do it. But of course, at times, and as I'm sure you experience as well, it is exhausting. But I also feel that it is really only in the moments of like tension that things really happen. And I mean, that's and I know you have humor, I think, as a powerful tool to use, I think, as well, as a way of getting people to talk about uncomfortable things in a way that kind of lifts it, makes it easier to talk about. But I do think that so many times, I think one of the problems and working with leadership teams, I mean, even at very high level in large organizations, you realize that there's a lot of dysfunction that comes from not being willing to lean into the discomfort. And so people, run away. They think that, oh, I don't need to deal with this. And they think that, oh, it doesn't impact anything, but it does.
Yeah, and I love that, because I think she was talking, I was sort of reflecting on my, and you're right. I think expertise brought softly, right? In other words, the expertise comes out rather than me telling you I'm an expert. Is just like, come with humility and ask great questions. And I think there's a certain amount of, we're encouraged to sort of blow our own trumpets and pretend that we're really good. And I mean, you're right. LinkedIn is exactly that space. It's sort of humbled to do this, and then you show off, right? There's sort of those
Sure.
lots and lots of people sort of banging on about it. And, I sort of used to think that was the playbook that was required. And now I'm just like, actually, I think a quiet confidence that you know stuff, but also recognition that you don't know stuff, particularly when you're dealing with these topics. It seems to me it's a partnership. Right. It's like, you cannot go, and I can't go into organizations and say, hey, I've looked at this for 30 seconds. Because I've seen this before, I'm going to diagnose the problem, tell you what to do, and then it'll be job done. It's got to be a collaboration, and you kind of need to help them to help themselves. And so the idea that one sort of turns up as this all-knowing expert, who the only person in the room that should be listened to, and everybody else just shut up and listen to me and then you'll solve it. It's obviously not going to work, right? Because they're living this thing. And if you want to design something that will sustain itself, that involves human beings, they've got to feel a sense of agency. Otherwise, you walk away and they're like, well, what do we do now? And so I love this idea. But you're right. The temptation when you're setting up a sort of advisory business is that I'm an advisor, I'm an expert, and I will come in and the way I will earn more money is by being more of an expert and be well known for being all this stuff. And I agree with you, but that takes a degree, it takes some experience, it takes some humility. And it's a little bit harder to sit back and sort of let the expertise shine through, because it means being a bit quieter. It means listening more than speak, all those sorts of things. So I recognize exactly what you're talking about. But I think quiet confidence, I know why I'm here, but I don't have all the answers, I think is super powerful. And as someone who spent many years sitting around tables, meetings where I honestly thought I shouldn't be here. I haven't got any value to add, but I'm required because of my status to be there, and therefore I better find something to say, and because that's how I add value. And I sometimes think actually just shutting up and listening, right, is way more productive. There are certain clients who look for I don't think they get the best possible advice, but they look for the loud people. They look for those with volume. They look for those with confidence. Actually, it might be because quietness and humility could be mistaken for a lack of confidence in what you're talking about.
Sure. Absolutely. And I think that's a problem in leadership in organizations as well, that we easily mistake humility for that. But yet I think it is the most powerful thing. I mean, choosing humility, I think, and for example, if you look at people who are in some type of conflict, or where there's a relational break of trust, like, the person is most powerful who chooses to get humble and take ownership of their part of whatever that relational conflict is about. And starting there, and that's actually what gives you agency. And so I think that we have a real sense of problem with that. I did an event, I think it was last year, with Klaus Moosmeyer, who I think you know was at Novartis, now Deutsche Bank, and Richard Bystrom, where we talked about like fighting corporate arrogance. And Klaus was saying, like, you don't really learn in business school to be humble. And yet that is absolutely critical. And we can see the consequences of arrogance every day.
But that's a really interesting. I was fascinated by that point there, because you can sort of see the logic, right? So I've paid a load of money to go to business school to learn some stuff, and I have to believe that confers a degree of expertise on me, because otherwise I wouldn't invest the money or whatever. And so when you come out, you could sort of see how that breeds people who are confident, overconfident, stroke arrogant, and yeah. You're right. It's probably not on the syllabus to go all this knowledge, because maybe that would be difficult to sell, right? You need to sell. The reason you're going to spend a load of money with us is you're going to get a whole load of things that will allow you to become really good at these things. And so that's not necessarily a natural thing, but I think it's a really, really valuable skill, to your point. And as I was thinking about organizations, I'm not sure that any of the appraisal systems I've ever come across have valued that. It's sort of, you get criticized for not speaking up in meeting. Doesn't ever say anything. Well, there's another way to phrase that, which is thoughtful about his or her contributions, but that's never valued. And I think a lot of the challenges that you're facing are the system that we have, and whether that's business school or whether that's the way promotions, appraisals, bonuses work within organizations, is it kind of reward. And we know this in extreme banking would be a great example. It in a way, it's rewarding the very things that you're having to manage the fallout from.
Yeah, and I've now spent many, many years working with, researching, reading about the topic of culture. And if you take that topic, am I an expert? Yes, I guess in some ways I might be, but it is such a big topic. And there's so much still to learn. And I think that's the important. It's not that we need to negate the knowledge and the experience that we have as leaders or as consultants. But I think it's having that humility that there's still so incredibly much to learn. And I think if you meet a group of 10 people, let's say a leadership team, and you start talking and interviewing them one by one, my first assumptions are very often wrong. And I'm going to be, this is it. But then I talked to another person. No, that wasn't really it. And then it takes time to see patterns. It takes time to be able to go deeper. And I love, a couple of years ago, I got to interview Professor Edgar Schein. He died a few years ago, and he was known as the father of modern culture research. And I really appreciate his work, but I also really appreciate his humility. He was someone who, even in his 80s, he was curious. He didn't come out as somebody. And if anyone should be the expert, on culture, it was him. But he came out with curiosity, and he wrote many books. But two of the books that he wrote were like Humble Inquiry and Humble Leadership. And both of them were basically really simple and very much about the importance of just asking and not coming from a position of knowing all the answers. And I think so many times in organizations where you've seen organizations kind of running amok or ending up in real trouble, there's been a real lack of listening. There's been a real lack of the willingness to really hear and want to understand what's really going on within the organization. I think often there's so much wisdom with the people at the front lines, but we're not necessarily listening to them. Frank Blake is a leader that I interviewed for my book. He was the CEO of the Home Depot. At that time they had 350,000 employees, and he's this really humble, simple guy to talk to. And when he said that when he came out to the stores and he would ask people about like what's going on here, the answer he would always get was like, everything's great, you're great, please leave. And that you know, that was always because people, you know, didn't want to. So he learned to ask different questions. He learned to ask, like, on a scale between 1 and 10, how do you think things are going? And then people would say maybe an 8. They would say, so what could we do to make it a 10? And I think just those examples to me, I mean, I think it's the people who are willing to break the silence, to go out, to have the humility to listen, and to really listen. You have to also have the foundational belief that you actually need to hear what they say, because otherwise it is, you know, quite much of performative. And so you actually have to have the humility to realize that I need the information that they have. I need the experience that they have. And I think that's what really great leadership looks like.
And I love that, because I was thinking about listening, the sort of going through the motions thing. It's almost worse when someone kind of goes, I want to hear what you have to say, and then demonstrates they have no interest whatsoever, because then you know for sure that they're not interested. Whereas if they're not sort of looking like they're listening, there is at least a possibility they're listening by the means. But if they've demonstrated it to you, which is where I think often these organizations, they put in place processes that purport to be feedback loops. But actually, you can tell pretty quickly. Human beings are not dumb, right? They can tell when they're not being listened to. And so I think this is a really interesting, you know, because often people sort of, I'd like the benefit of looking like we listen, right? Because we recognize there's some value in it, but we don't actually want to, God, they might say something, we'd have to do something about it, right? We might discover some unpleasant things. Yes. And so I've seen tons of processes that I'm not saying they deliberately say to people, set up a process that looks like a sham, you know, to do the better, but that's kind of where you end up, right? It's obvious they're not in it, that obviously they're not interested. And so I often think that's worse, because you've expended effort to try and get the propaganda benefit without actually showing any interest. And people can sense that. It's a sort of it's a two-way feedback loop. And I think it's fascinating when your leaders sort of think, well, we'll broadcast to them and then occasionally we'll listen back. But that's not how human interactions work, right? We're constantly working each other out. And so this idea of working out what's going on, I think, is critical. The other thought that amused me was, as you were talking about, you form an initial impression, and then you do a bit more talking, go get some more impressions. Then you realize that initial impression isn't the full picture. It's part of the picture, clearly, because it's an impression. I was thinking about management consultancy firms, the big ones, and their whole thing is quickly formulate a hypothesis and then go and get evidence to, well, they say prove or disprove, but 9 times out of 10, for exactly the reasons you've already identified, it's literally, you're going to go with, and of course that plays into their business model, where they're often hired to prove to validate a decision that's already been made. So this is all kind of in the same space. And so I love that idea. You just going, right, I've worked this out, but actually maybe I'll just go and ask again. Oh, no, I really haven't. And that way I think lies interesting discovery. But this seems anathema to many organizations, and particularly I think in a high sort of fast moving world. You know, we need to make quick decisions because the world is changing quickly. Well, sometimes a quick decision is a good one, right? But often we need to slow things down a bit. And my sense is a lot of your work is being a bit more thoughtful around things. Let's see what's going on here. Let's understand. Let's not sort of be caught up in the day-to-day what's going on, but step back a little bit. And that's the value that you bring. Is that a good way to look at it?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we work with, I would say, a lot of organizations that are under very high pressure. So it's very generally high pressure environment. We say we work with high stakes industries where, you know, cultural issues have significant impact both on clients, but that might also be on patients. It might be on society, and so on. So the stakes are high. The pressure is also often very high. Pressure to perform, pressure to deliver. So I think in those environments, I mean, it's not like they are slow and they have more time to reflect. It's just that if you want to build trust over time, and if you want to sustain trust over time, because I think in every organization, I mean, there are certain things that are, you know, helping us move towards the vision we have. There are certain things that might be, you know, getting us a little bit of course, and then there are certain things that could, you know, completely, you know, smash us out of the road, and we need to reflect on all of them, but they're often very difficult to see, and too often we just assume that things are great and we just run forward because we don't want to see, and then we get the consequences further down the road. And I think that's where, like, yes, then it is about, in that sense, not necessarily stopping, but taking the time, both as a leader, and that's something we encourage when we work with changing culture, because and this really builds on Edgar Schein's work, which is really the dialogic approach to see that culture is much created by conversations by that people are having within an organization, where they form opinions, where they make decisions, where they elaborate, where they create understanding about why things turned out the way they do, and so on. And so you need to impact those conversations, and you need to create space for people to actually take the moment of reflection. Because if we don't reflect, and there was a certain venture capitalist who recently said that he doesn't need any introspection or anything like that, and that's a very new idea, which I think research doesn't at all bear out. But anyway, I think we need to get that into the rhythm of organizations. And of course, that in a way it means stopping, but it doesn't mean stopping everything you're doing. But I think about it like this way. I was out canoeing with my daughter many years ago, and we were going, and she wanted to sit in the back and steer the canoe, and we were going, from one bank to the other bank, continually just getting stuck in trees and stuff like that. And I think, when you're canoeing, you want to be, intentional about trying to stay centered, and you want to get the signals that help you see where you're veering off course. And I think that's true should be true in our personal lives and in our organizations as well. That instead of, going from one end to this end, we want to make sure that we are continually catching the signals that help us see where we're veering off course. And that takes some work for sure, but it also saves you a lot. And I think that's the reality. For example, when let's say you acquire a company, and you don't take the time to listen to people and really understand what their concerns are, their fears are, and what is really important to understand to actually integrate the companies and create a shared vision and so on. So you say, we don't have the time, we have to run fast, so on. But then 5 years down the road, the people in that company that was acquired, they still refuse to collaborate with the others. They still talk about the good old times. They still, are stuck because you didn't do that work. So I think that work actually saves you a lot of time.
I love all of these things. And as you're talking, we're getting a sense of the sort of work that you do and how you go about doing it. How do you, I guess, simple question, how do you market yourself? And what's the sort of elevator pitch of what you can do for people? How do you present this offering? Because it's clearly tremendously valuable. Back to, you have to want to buy it in the first place, right? So it's way more valuable than lots more organizations you could help. But what is it that, what are people sort of looking at in terms of the menu, and therefore what are they coming to you for?
Yeah. So, we say basically that we help organizations identify what is undermining the root causes, undermining their cultural health, and then change their culture. And our focus around that is very much around leadership habits, because our insight has been that, and that culture is so much shaped by the signals that leaders send. And I think, typically we can focus a lot on the tone from the top, and the tone from the top. And I would say the example from the top is really critical. And I think let's also differentiate between tone and example, because it's easy, for them to give a message or send out an email that HR, ethics and compliance has written, but it's a different thing to model that in their daily interactions with the organization. But aside from that, for example, we might have a CEO saying, "Speak up, we're listening," but then we have a manager 10,000 kilometers away who says, "Shut up, I'm done with your complaining," for example. And I think that's the reality many times. And I think for both you and I, and probably for many of our listeners, you're part of larger, more complex organizations, maybe in different countries, maybe in lots of different departments. So the culture is so much set by the signals that managers at every level send. And of course, that doesn't happen through an initiative. It doesn't happen just because we do these workshops that all it's mandatory for everyone to run across the company. I'm not saying that that's bad necessarily, but it typically doesn't really change behavior or change the way decisions are made. So if we want to change that, then we need to change how decisions are made in the everyday. We need to impact what the conversations that I had in the regular team meetings across in the organization. We need to impact how leaders are actually listening and the questions they ask, and we need to impact the way they self-reflect and the way they think about their decisions and so on. And to do that takes then shifting habits, which is really, really difficult work. A lot of our work is, again, back to understanding what are the root causes, and then how do we create journeys for the organization to evolve and really evolve leadership habits. And for us, we found that a really, really important part of that is to create communities of practice across the organization. So I think that there's a limit to how helpful it is to teach things. And so teaching that is important, but you need people actually to take the time to practice. And I think they do that the best in community with their peers, where they actually over time learn to have difficult conversations about their leadership, the challenges they're facing, the learnings they're getting, the changes they're starting to implement, and so on, and keeping each other accountable.
And who is it that's hiring you? Because as you're talking, I mean, it's very clear that this only works, to your point, you need senior level buy-in.
Yeah.
So I'm fascinated by who is coming to you and what function is this an HR driven thing or is this a business driven thing? Who makes the decision to hire you typically?
Yeah. So, I mean, that is a combination. I mean, sometimes it might be ethics and compliance, sometimes it might be HR, sometimes it might be business leaders. What I think is true in all cases is that there needs to be, of course, real, as you say, executive level buy-in and ownership of this. So it might be that somebody is the person who kind of takes the initiative, but then the ownership really needs to lie with business leaders. So I think that's really, really critical.
I always say in my business, I need behavioral science to sell behavioral science, right? So if I'm coming into an organization to sort of help them to adapt a more behavioral approach, I need to be thinking about that as I try and get, because I've almost, in order to get them to, if I'm thinking about compliance function, in order to get them to think behaviorally, I've got to think behaviorally about how I'm trying to influence them. I presume there's quite a lot because it would be, there's a way to market what you do that I think would fail completely, which would be to sort of, and back to the sort of very aggressive, pushy, here's the framework, here's the solution. And what I love about your work is you do end up with very practical stuff, but it's not sold in a kind of silver bullet, loud shouting. You recognize, as you were saying, some of it is hard to change established behaviors, particularly where you feel like those established behaviors are what you're required to do. You come in with quite a soft approach in many respects, a very inquiring approach. But what comes out at the other end is very, very practical, and you do use frameworks and those sorts of things. Talk us a little bit about that process, because what I loved about it is often people lead with the framework as if that's the big solution. My sense is yours is led much more from a sense of curiosity and inquiry that then brings us to a place that there is some practical stuff at the end of it, but you're not leading with that.
No, and I think, of course, process is really important. Frameworks are important. I think, however, in conversations when I'm in with a room of leaders, for example, I'm increasingly realizing that just giving them a lot of research and a lot of leadership models is not, doing a lot, but getting really, really personal and vulnerable makes a lot more difference and gets people much more to have real conversations about the topics. But because I've been grappling really with the question of how do you change culture? And feeling that a lot of the work that we were doing at the time, that it was not necessarily that helpful or it didn't give the types of results that I wanted to see. So it really became that journey. So, and then becoming increasingly focused on, so how do we shift leadership behavior? And then I went on the journey of writing my book Human Culture, and I mean it took me 7 years, and on that journey I tried to, pull the different pieces together, because I feel that for especially leaders who are generally very busy under a lot of pressure, like they need something that feels tangible. And so I looked at what are the habits that are super critical. And I must say, actually, a very important and time-consuming part of the concept or part of the process was arriving on something that could be simple to digest and understand. And the idea of the 4 habits that I talk about: get humble, get clear, get listening, get integrity, and then the 12 practices. And what is beautiful with that is that it also maps onto a year, which my wife helped me see. And then you realize, oh, like there's something here in terms of a structure that becomes a learning journey that makes it like more applicable. But I think even with that, you need to do that with a lot of humility, in terms of saying that this is part of it. And then, the 4th habit is around getting integrity. And of course, there you come to a lot of the things of incentives and processes and rituals within an organization. And of course, all of these topics are so big, and all of them have such different types of impact on the culture of the organization. So of course, it's not just, yes, it is working with the change journey of each leader, but it's also about the bigger system, and we have to look at both. But what I found is that when you start from the place of the awareness of the leaders, then you also have much more openness to start looking at the system and looking at, are these systems working against, or are they sustaining what we're trying to achieve? So I think it's really important to have that clarity, but you also always have to be very, very clear on that there's not a silver bullet. Every organization is, of course, they have their specific history and all of that they're coming from. And I think you need to go into that with a lot of curiosity.
Love this. And you mentioned the book, so we should absolutely talk about that. Tell us about the choice of title, because I loved it because it was deceptively simple and very engaging. Just talk us through that and what's in the book.
Yeah, so the title is Human Culture, and I must say that it's like I've been thinking about the title for years, and I'm not so sure that I'm so super happy what it turned out to be. But anyway, I mean, what we just wanted to say is more of an encouraging statement that you can and really to say that like culture is your responsibility. And you can actually have influence, and that you have certain amount of agency. So in the book, I share a bit of my story, but then I take leaders on the journey of the 4 habits and the 12 practices, and where I try to combine being really raw and vulnerable with my own challenges, struggles, often failures, then also drawing in great examples from people that I met across the way that are really helpful, and then getting really practical and actionable, and ending up so each practice is like a 15-20 minute read, and it ends up with reflection questions and an action. And the action is not saying do this, but it is saying define what you will do, and then helping them think through how they define that. And so that's the journey. And I've been super happy to see how, of course, many people read it just like a book, but how many have taken it to their leadership teams, into their organizations, and actually apply it in that way. And I just want to say this is a little bit of a plug here, but this is a completely free resource that we just launched, which is available on healthycultures.co. where we talk about, because we want to see a movement of leaders who say kind of enough is enough with the type of irresponsible leadership and unhealthy cultures that we see all around. We need to do something different. It's not okay. I mean, it hinders us from delivering on our mission. And it also, I mean, sometimes it costs people their lives. Like we can't go on this way. And what we've done there is we put up a manifesto and some commitments that we believe are just super central to what responsible leaders look like. And then we invite leaders to sign up and get on a journey, and where they're going to get a lot of the insights, the content from the book, but it's as a challenging reminder and a support to get them to take the journey, start by looking themselves in the mirror, and then starting to see what actually needs to change in my culture, in my leadership, and make the commitment to do that. And I know we see kind of it's free, but it's also costly, because I think that's the thing of what I generally say about this work, and I mean, culture can be a complex topic, and the topics that many of our clients work with, and I'm sure true for yours as well, are very complex things. But when it comes to the leadership that is required, that's not necessarily complex, but it is hard, because it will challenge your comfort. And yeah.
And you absolutely should plug this, because I think one of the things that I find fascinating is when I speak to people like you. Now, clearly, right, you want to make money to be able to keep the lights on and do things, right? But it's very, very clear to me this is a mission, right? And you believe passionately in doing this. And of course, you want to get paid and rewarded for the effort that you're putting in. But bottom line is, you really care, right? You want this stuff to change because you've identified something that, I guess because of your experience, but also just generally who you are, which is clearly formed partly by your experience, that you want to make a difference here. And I think it's really interesting listening to you, which is to sort of say, we could do better and we need to do better. And it's kind of, in a way, you're calling society out, right? And just going, this is not good enough. And I think it's interesting when you talk about it's free, but it's costly. These things feel like it's like, oh man, I've got enough things to do running the business without having to worry about these other things. And culture, of course, is a slightly longer term project. And so often with things like quarterly reporting, it doesn't fit neatly into that world of solving the short term problems. But I love the way you talk about it, because clearly you give a damn, right? And you want this stuff to change. And so the heart of this is not, you've gone, here's a little niche where I could make loads of money. It's genuinely a passion project that needs to sustain itself, right? And you've got a team and all the rest of it. But that's the real drive of this, right? Is you think we could do better, and we should do better, and we need to do better.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I mean, just take the Epstein scandal that I'm sure all of us have, our scandal, I mean, the abuse. So many people who saw things but didn't say anything. So many people who suffered as a consequence. And I think this is I mean, and the reality is that most of us have never been invited to somebody's private island, and we don't know what we would have said if we would have been. And there were a lot of people that had a lot of things to gain from their connection with Epstein, and so it's not from a place of like judgment in that sense, but it is a judgment of all of us. I think that we allow, and of course a lot of that was in the business world, and in the world that we in the academic world and the business world. And so yes, I think that there's a change, and I think that's also something, or there's a need for change, and I think it's also something I really appreciate with you, Christian, that what I feel, and for the people who know you, I've worked alongside you, and just that you are someone that really inspires people to take seriously the importance of understanding behavioral science as, and especially in the way that I've met you. It's been around the ethics and compliance environment, and I think that's something I really appreciate, that it's like clear listening to you that it comes from that place of a passion and a mission, and you actually want to see you want to see a change there as well, because we spend so much money, time, and resources on things that actually don't give the desired result, or sometimes, or too many times, I think, actually give the wrong results. And so what you're doing is incredibly important. So yeah.
Well, I'll take that, thank you, and right back at you, which is why I wanted to get you on the show. But as you were talking there, I think there's something really interesting here, which is your focal point is I guess organizations, but I'd look at that sort of business is a key piece. And there was something interesting in what you just said there about looking at doing this within businesses and the impact that people have. But what I find fascinating is the impact that businesses have now, because of the scale of many of them, is societal. And I was thinking about, and there's obvious things like sort of carbon footprint and climate and those sort of topics, but with tech companies, the influence that they have over society, and we can kind of go on and look at the impact, the shadow or the footprint that these organizations have. But there's something there, as you were talking, that I thought was really, really interesting, that goes back to your comment earlier about LinkedIn, where I thought actually, as I was thinking, lots of people don't speak up about things because they're scared about the implications it will have on their job. So we see this on LinkedIn, right?
Sure.
I get loads of people who've read my posts who I know agree with it, so that was great, but I can't respond. And the only thing I can assume is that it's linked to their career, because they're perfectly happy to talk about it in other environments, but they're worried about what their employer might think. And I understand why, because it's linked to, as the name implies, you're linked into your employer. But there's something interesting there about that unwillingness to speak up. And so as I hear you talk, I kind of think, back to, I'm not going to criticize them either, because actually this podcast is a really good example, right? I had the jingle for this podcast recorded way back while I was still employed, but I didn't have the courage to do it until I was working for myself. And then I thought, I've got no excuse anymore. And why didn't I do it? Well, because I thought my employer might not. Now, there's no rule that said I couldn't do it, but I recognized I might be
Sure.
like it just wasn't comfortable doing it. And so I back to your not critical, I'm sympathetic to these things. But that sort of points me in a direction where it says, I kind of think whether or not you and I want to do this, we have to speak up on this stuff, right? Because we are unencumbered and it's relevant to what we do. And so I think, sadly, whether we want to or not, and I think we probably do want to because it feels good to do it, is we have to call this stuff out and speak up on it. And so when I come across people like you, sort of kindred spirit, we're not dealing with exactly the same issue. And yet we're looking at things and going, this is not good enough. This is not right. This is wasting people's time. And ultimately, the consequences are much worse than that as well. And we need to do something about it. And I feel compelled to do something for as much as I care about it as well. I feel like there's an extra responsibility on me because I don't have these encumbrances. Because if I can't speak up about this stuff, who can? And I think you're the same, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I want to say that, I mean, I really have a deep passion for organizations. And I think for the clients, the organizations that we work with, whether they function well or not, I mean, it actually matters. It actually has a real impact. And of course, you can say, I mean, I think about that sometimes. You go out and visit clients where it's so clear that the cities where their headquarters are and so on are built up like almost completely around that company. So you can see it so like just in the physical place, how they impact that society. But it also, of course, has an impact on on their ability to innovate great medicines or create a genius new device that will help someone, or if they use corrupt practices to bribe doctors, or if they're creating defense equipment that if they're able to, I mean, now we have a whole continent that needs to ramp up their defense. My wife is Ukrainian, so that's a topic that's close to my heart. And the ability to do that, and also the way we do that, and who do we sell to, and how do we make decisions, and how do we make sure not to cut corners, and like all those things. I mean, it really matters. So yes, it matters for the individuals, but it also really matters that the organizations deliver on the missions they have. I don't know. I probably went out on a tangent there, but
no, I love it. I absolutely love it, because I was nodding. I know exactly what you're talking about with these companies that are massive in one location and they dominate the skyline, and they're part of the history of the locale, and therefore that has that local impact. But I love this idea of the broader piece. Now, I think you make a really, really good point, because I think often business decisions, you could sort of argue, well, it's nobody else's business. It's just the shareholders and the employees, just the obvious stake. But I think the stakeholders go on, and it sets the tone for society. What kind of world do we want to live in? And I think a lot, as we're talking, we don't have to point too far in the world of politics to recognize that there are certain politicians who are behaving in some of the ways that you describe. And so I think this stuff really, really matters, and we have to start fixing it. And, you know, the world of politics is a bit more of a challenge because you've got an electorate that doesn't always necessarily think, but I think businesses can change and businesses should change. And so that I think all this stuff is really important. So I love that. I think when people talk in the way that they do, they're clearly passionate about what they're doing, which just screams across. I could keep talking to you forever. I'm going to have you back on the show because I think you're going to have some more interesting things to talk about. But before I let you go this time, remind people the name of your company, the book, anything else that they need to know. I will put links to all of it in the show notes, but let's hear you say it so that people know what they can get, how they can find you.
Yeah. So Christian, first, I just want to say big thank you for this conversation. I really appreciated it. It felt like, even though we couldn't sit down in the same location, it felt like sitting down with a friend and having a conversation about something that is truly important to us. And I believe to many of our listeners as well. So thank you for that opportunity. And then to say that, so the book is You Can Culture. You can find it in bookstores online and, for example, Amazon.com. The company's Heart Management, heartmanagement.org. And to go for the free resources that I talked about, go to healthycultures.co, where you can read the manifesto and see if this resonates you and if that's a commitment you want to make, and start that journey, which I really encourage you to do.
And the other thing we didn't pick up, which we probably should, Tobias, is where you're based, because I think people might detect from the name and the accent roughly the right part of the world. But let's tell people where. I mean, obviously you can help people globally, but where are you based? We didn't cover that.
So I'm based in Malmö, Sweden. I will, however, relocate for some time, but I'm currently based here. Yes.
Which fans of the TV series The Bridge will know is one half of that bridge where interesting things happen.
Exactly.
Fabulous part of the world. I must go back there. I haven't been back to that part of the world since before the pandemic, so that's an encouragement for me to do that. But Tobias, as ever, when I speak to you, like time just flies. You get my brain racing, which is the biggest compliment I can pay. So thank you for all the work that you do, but above all, thank you for being a fabulous guest on the show.
Thank you.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to you for listening, and of course to Tobias for appearing. To find out more about Tobias, his company Heart Management, the free resources that he talked about, and his book You Can Culture, Transformative Leadership Habits for a Thriving Workplace, Positive Impact and Lasting Success, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. Where have you been? You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To discover previous episodes of the show, and no matter how long you've been listening, I suspect there's an episode out there that you won't have heard, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review or rating for it, please do so on whichever platform you're listening to the show on. It really, really does help. I will be back soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe. Remember that we can all find ourselves joining cults of whatever kind that might not necessarily be good for us, so keep an eye out for that. But above all, stay safe, and thank you so much for listening.